She was born in 1913, in a small village surrounded by endless fields and forests, a place where life was measured not in years, but in harvests. Her name was Zinaida Tusnolobova, and she grew up knowing that kindness could be as powerful as strength. Her family was poor, like most in rural Russia, but their poverty was honest. Her childhood was filled with hard work, simple joys, and the quiet rhythm of survival. From a young age, she helped her parents with chores, carrying water, chopping firewood, watching her younger brothers. She learned that compassion wasn't a word, it was an act. When neighbours fell ill, she brought them herbs. When someone cried, she stayed until they stopped. By her teenage years, she had decided what she wanted to be: a nurse. In those times, medicine was more intuition than science. Hospitals were few, equipment primitive, but the work mattered. Zinaida trained as a medical assistant in a district hospital, where she changed bandages, held trembling hands, and tried to quiet the fear in patients' eyes. The 1930s were harsh: famine, suspicion, the slow machinery of state. But Zinaida had no taste for politics. Her calling was life itself. She used to say, "It doesn't matter who commands the country, as long as someone is left to heal it." Then came June 1941. The radio announced that Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. The next morning, her hospital filled with soldiers, dusty, bleeding, half-conscious. The war that had seemed far away arrived on stretchers. When volunteers were called for the front, Zinaida didn't hesitate. She left her small village with a single bag, a medical kit, and a letter from her mother folded inside her coat. "You will see more pain than any woman should," the letter said. "But remember, saving one life means you've won your own battle." At first, the front looked like chaos painted in grey: trenches, smoke, frozen mud, and faces turned pale from exhaustion. The wounded came faster than she could count. She learned to sleep sitting, to work by the flicker of a lantern, to tie a tourniquet with one hand while the other pressed on a wound. Her first rescue came during a night bombardment. A platoon was caught in open field when German mortars, merciless winter that froze the dead where they fell. She wrapped soldiers in her own coat, gave them her gloves, fed them snow when there was no water. "A nurse's hands must be warm," she said. "If they're cold, people stop believing you can save them." Her uniform was stained with blood and soot, her boots torn, but her resolve was clean. To the soldiers, she became a symbol, not of medicine, but of endurance. They called her sister, not out of politeness, but out of need. In letters to her family, she wrote not about fear or horror, but about work. "I carry them as long as my legs move. Sometimes I think I cannot go again, and then I see another face, and I do." She never counted how many lives she saved. Numbers didn't matter, movement did. Each rescue was a rebellion against death, and yet, beneath her calm, she began to feel the slow burn of exhaustion. Her hands shook after long shifts, her eyes blurred from smoke. She saw too many men die whispering names of wives and mothers, and sometimes those names echoed her own. But every dawn she stood up again, cleaned her instruments, and walked toward the noise. In early 1942, the front moved closer to Smolensk. The fighting there was relentless, villages burned, fields littered with shrapnel. The medics were ordered to retreat, but Zinaida refused to abandon the wounded. "I cannot leave them," she said. "They carried rifles for us. I will carry them back." That decision would define the rest of her life, because soon she would crawl through snow and smoke for one more rescue, and it would be her last as a whole woman. She would not yet know that the very hands saving others would soon be taken from her. But for now she worked through pain, through fear, through the unending thunder of war, a quiet woman in a blood-stained coat, walking straight into the storm, answering the call she had chosen long before the world began to burn. The front never slept. It breathed, bled, and shifted, a living monster made of smoke and steel. For Zinaida Tusnolobova, life became a rhythm of screams, explosions, and footsteps through mud. The word fear lost its meaning. The body moved even when the mind begged to stop. By 1942, she was part of a Frontline medical detachment near the Smolensk region, a place that maps would later describe only with red arrows and casualty counts. To her, it was simply a world of snow and silence, interrupted by the sounds of men dying. Each day began before dawn. She boiled water in a tin pot blackened by smoke, checked her bandages, and waited for the first stretcher. When the shooting started, she moved forward, always forward. Her hands learned to work automatically. Cut, bind, inject, lift. She no longer flinched at torn flesh or the colour of blood. She said later, "After the 10th scream, you stop hearing them. You only see where the next one is." The fire line. One afternoon, her unit received an order: evacuate the wounded before an expected German artillery strike. There were too many, dozens scattered across open ground. Zinaida and 2 other medics crawled into the field, dragging a stretcher between them. The snow was red, the air thick with powder and smoke. Each body felt heavier than the last. She pulled until her arms went numb, until her knees sank in blood and ice. A shell exploded nearby, throwing her face first into the mud. Her ears rang, her vision blurred, but she kept crawling. When she reached the trench again, her hands were shaking uncontrollably, but she went back out. The commander shouted for her to stop. She didn't even turn around. That night, she and her comrades saved more than 30 men. Only 3 of them would survive the hospital trip, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were not left to die alone. In her notebook, she wrote one line before falling asleep: "Even when the sky burns, there must be someone who still kneels beside the living." The toll of work. Weeks blurred into months. The front shifted east and west, but for Zinaida, every battlefield looked the same, grey and endless. She carried men on her back, wrapped them in her own coat, whispered to them when morphine ran out. Sometimes she sang, not because it helped, but because it kept her from crying. "Wouldn't wake up tomorrow." The Battle of February. February 1942. A name she would later speak with both pride and pain. Her battalion was surrounded during a German counterattack. Communication lines were cut, supplies ran out. The wounded lay in open snow, their bodies freezing before the enemy shells reached them. Zinaida was ordered to stay behind the line, but she didn't. She ran into the field, dragging a stretcher toward the cries. Machine gun fire stitched the ground around her. She fell twice, got up twice, and kept moving. She reached a young soldier, barely 18, his stomach torn open, eyes wide with shock. He tried to speak, no words came. She pressed her hands against his wound, whispering, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." He died before she finished the sentence. She sat there for a moment, frozen, until another explosion forced her to move. Her breath came in gasps, the world narrowed to white and red. By nightfall, she had dragged 6 men out of the field. Her uniform was soaked with blood, her hair stiff with ice. She collapsed beside the trench, her pulse weak but steady. When they found her, she was half buried in snow, still clutching her medical satchel. The shadow of exhaustion. After that battle, she could barely lift her arms. Her body was failing, but she refused to leave. She said, "If I can still walk, I can still work." The doctors begged her to rest. She ignored them. It wasn't pride, it was duty. One evening, as the front quieted for a rare moment, she sat by a dying fire, staring into the flames. Her comrade asked what she would do after the war. She thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I'll plant an orchard," she said, "something that grows instead of burns." It was the only dream she ever confessed. The calm before. By late February, orders came to advance again. Snowstorms swept the forest roads, covering the dead and the living alike. Zinaida's detachment was tasked with evacuating the wounded during the offensive. The night before the operation, she cleaned her instruments, refilled her bag, and wrote another line in her notebook. "If I fall tomorrow, I hope someone carries me the same way." The next morning, the bombardment began. Shells rained down before she opened her eyes again. When she did, she saw only shadows. The light had left her. But not her courage. She didn't know it yet, but she had entered the next chapter of her life, the one where her strength would no longer be measured by movement, but by endurance. The battle for survival was about to begin anew, this time against her own body. When Zinaida awoke, the world was made of noise. A deep, hollow hum filled her ears, as though she was still inside the explosion. Voices came and went, Russian, faint, blurred. Someone said her name. Someone else said, "She's alive." She tried to move her hands but felt nothing. Her body refused to answer. Only the pain remained, a heavy, burning weight where her limbs used to be. Then darkness rolled over her again. Between life and death. Days passed before she understood what had happened. She was in a field hospital, surrounded by the moans of other survivors. Her face was bandaged, her skin burned, her body unrecognizable. When a nurse finally whispered the truth, she stared at the ceiling without blinking. Her hands were gone. Her legs too. The blast had taken nearly everything but her heart. She lay there, silent, breathing in the antiseptic air. For the first time since the war began, she couldn't move toward anyone's pain. All she could do was listen to her own. At night she heard the wounded crying for help. Her instincts screamed to rise, to go, to do what she had always done. But she couldn't. She could only whisper, "Hold on, hold on." The same words she had once spoken to others. In her later notes she would write, "The hardest moment was not losing my limbs, it was losing my work. I had built my life on helping others, and now I had to let them help me." The long winter. Recovery was a word that didn't belong in that place. The hospital near Smolensk was overcrowded, cold, and starved of supplies. Doctors fought to keep infection away. Many didn't survive. Zinaida hovered between life and death for weeks. She drifted in and out of fever, sometimes hearing explosions that weren't there. She once asked the nurse beside her, "How many did we save?" The woman paused, unsure what to say. Then she replied softly, "Enough." That answer became her anchor. When spring arrived, they moved her to Moscow for surgery. She had no hands, no legs, and fading eyesight, yet she refused morphine most days. She wanted to stay awake, to remember what it meant to feel. Doctors marveled at her will to live. "Most would give up," one surgeon said. "She simply refuses to." Orderly tried to comfort her. She said, "Don't pity me. I've seen what pity looks like. It looks like surrender." The letter. In mid-1943, her story reached the newspapers. Soviet correspondents visited her ward, taking notes for morale reports. They expected tragedy. They found fire. Even without arms or legs, she spoke calmly, almost commandingly. "If I could stand," she told them, "I would go back to the front tomorrow." Her words spread across the country. Soon letters began arriving, hundreds, then thousands. From soldiers, nurses, factory workers, schoolchildren. They wrote of admiration, guilt, and love. One soldier wrote, "When I think I can't fight anymore, I remember you. If you can live without arms, I can fight with mine." Those words changed her. For the first time she realized she was still saving lives, not on the battlefield, but through her endurance. She dictated her own response, addressed to "my brothers at the front." "I cannot hold a rifle now, but my heart is still with you. Each of you carries a piece of me, the part that still fights." That letter was printed in newspapers across the USSR. It was read aloud in trenches, pinned to barracks walls, carried in soldiers' pockets. Men who never met her swore they would fight for the sister who gave everything. Rebirth. Months later, she was transferred to a rehabilitation center in Leningrad. There she was fitted with prosthetics, heavy, mechanical, unforgiving. She fell constantly, but laughed each time. "If I can't walk, I'll crawl," she said. "It's still forward." Her vision never returned fully, but she learned to recognize people by voice and touch. She began mentoring younger nurses, teaching them technique and compassion. Her body was broken, but her authority remained intact. Doctors who once thought she would never leave bed now watched her move through the ward, instructing others how to comfort the wounded. She had become what war could not destroy, a living emblem of endurance. What remained? By the end of 1944, Zinaida Tusnolobova had been awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The medal hung from her uniform, pinned by another's hand. When reporters asked how she felt, she said, It is not a reward. It is a reminder of every. When the war finally moved away from her, it didn't take the pain with it. The front grew distant, but the war inside her body had only just begun. Months passed. The seasons changed beyond her window, but Zinaida lived in a world of white sheets, bandages, and antiseptic. The nurses had grown used to her voice, firm, sometimes sharp, but always grateful. She never asked why this happened to her. She only asked what comes next. She had lost her arms, her legs, much of her eyesight, but she hadn't lost her will to lead. Every morning she demanded to know how many soldiers were in the ward, how many survived the night, what new arrivals needed blood transfusions. The doctors laughed softly. "You're not our patient, you're our commander." And she smiled, because that was true. The dark year. In 1944, when her strength began to return, she was sent to a sanatorium near Moscow. It was quiet there, too quiet. The silence felt heavier than artillery fire. She had always been surrounded by voices, soldiers, nurses, comrades, and now she heard only her own breathing. At first she fell into despair. She couldn't hold a cup, couldn't write her name, couldn't even wipe away her own tears. She hated the helplessness more than pain. But then she remembered her letter, the one she had dictated to the soldiers at the front. "My heart is still with you. Each of you carries a piece of me, the part that still fights." She realized that meant she had to keep fighting too, so she began training again. Not her body, but her spirit. She learned to eat with the help of a mechanical arm, to balance herself on a frame, to speak clearly even through exhaustion. She treated her recovery like a mission. "I'm still a soldier," she said, "only my weapon has changed." The nurses, who once pitied her, started looking to her for strength. She became their example, living proof that survival could be louder than death. A new life. In 1945, when the war finally ended, Moscow erupted in celebration. Fireworks burst over Red Square. People danced in the streets. Zinaida heard the noise from her hospital bed. She smiled faintly and whispered, "We won." But inside she knew victory had left her behind. The next day she asked the doctors for a typewriter. A fellow veteran named Alexei. He had lost an arm in combat and walked with a limp, but his smile never faltered. He read to her, told stories of his unit, made her laugh, something she hadn't done in months. At first she resisted. She told him, "You shouldn't waste your time on someone like me." He answered, "You're exactly the kind of person worth my time." He visited every week. When she was finally discharged, he proposed. She said no 3 times. Then, one evening, she simply said, "If you can carry me through life, I'll walk beside you in every other way." They married quietly that summer. No parade, no ceremony. Just 2 wounded souls learning to build something whole again. The hero returns. In the years that followed, Zinaida became a nurse once more, this time for the wounded of peace. She worked at a rehabilitation centre, helping amputees adapt to prosthetics. She couldn't perform medical procedures herself, but she taught, advised, and comforted. When new patients arrived, silent, ashamed, broken, she would roll into their rooms and say, "I know what you're thinking. I thought it too." But life doesn't end where pain begins. It begins where you decide to keep going. Her words carried more healing than any medicine. Soon, the Soviet press began calling her the woman who defeated the impossible. She disliked the title. "I didn't defeat anything," she said. "I just refused to surrender." Her life became a lesson for an entire generation of veterans struggling to find purpose. The voice of memory. By the 1960s, Zinaida had become a national symbol of resilience. She spoke in schools, hospitals, and veterans gatherings. Her speeches were calm, almost maternal. War doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It lives inside those who heard them. But so does love, if you let it. Children listened in awe, soldiers stood at attention, and even generals bowed their heads. Her presence carried the gravity of truth. In one interview she was asked, "Do you ever wish you had died that day?" She paused, then said quietly, "No. Death would have been easier. Living taught me more." Legacy of courage. Zinaida Tusnolobova lived long after the war, long enough to see the world she helped save change beyond recognition. She raised 2 children, worked tirelessly for veterans, and wrote letters until her eyesight faded. Her funeral was small, quiet, attended mostly by nurses and veterans. They laid her to rest beneath a simple stone. No grand speeches, no orchestra, only the soft wind moving through the birch trees. She had entered the world as a healer, lived as a soldier, and left as a symbol. And though her body had long been broken, her story remained whole, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones fought within. The war had ended, but the silence it left behind was heavy. For most, it was a time to rebuild, to forget, to move forward. But for Zinaida Tusnolobova, forgetting was impossible. Her scars were too deep, her body too changed. So instead of escaping her pain, she chose to turn it into a purpose, a symbol of strength. In the years after the war, letters kept arriving, hundreds of them, written by people she had never met. Soldiers who had lost their limbs, mothers who had lost sons, young girls who dreamed of becoming nurses. They all asked the same question: how did you keep going? Zinaida answered every single one. Her handwriting was shaky, written with the help of a mechanical pen strapped to her shoulder brace, but her words were steady. You must start by forgiving the world for what it took from you, and then by giving something back. Her responses spread across the Soviet Union, reprinted in newspapers, read aloud in schools, broadcast on the radio. People began to call her not just a war hero, but a teacher of courage. The wounded healer. She began visiting hospitals and rehabilitation centres, moving between wards in her wheelchair with a calm authority that silenced every room she entered. Doctors would pause their rounds just to listen. Patients sat up when they heard her voice. She never spoke about her own suffering. Instead, she talked about others, about the medics who froze to death carrying stretchers, about soldiers who shielded their comrades with their bodies. She made heroism sound ordinary, as if it were simply part of being human. Her favourite phrase was, "Pain is not a prison, it is proof that you are still alive." One nurse later recalled, when she spoke, it felt like sunlight through the window of a cold room. Over time, Zinaida's visits became official events. She represented veterans at government ceremonies, attended conferences, and even travelled abroad as part of Soviet medical delegations. But she never let the formality dull her message. "I'm not here for speeches," she once told a reporter. "I'm here to remind people what it costs to stop caring." The living monument. By the late 1950s, her story was taught in schools as part of moral education. Children recited her quotes in classrooms, drew her portrait for exhibitions, and sent her their own essays about courage. Once let her call herself disabled. To him, she was whole. Every anniversary of the war's end, they lit a single candle and sat in silence. Not for grief, but for memory. She once told a journalist, "We light it for those who never saw peace, and to remind ourselves that peace is work, not rest." Speaking to a new generation, as the 1960s brought new wars and political turbulence, Zinaida's voice found renewed meaning. She began visiting universities and youth groups, warning against forgetting the lessons of suffering. Her speeches were simple, stripped of propaganda. Courage isn't about medals, it's about compassion. A nation that forgets kindness will one day need heroes again. Students listened in absolute silence. Some cried. Many wrote to her afterward, calling her grandmother Zina, the moral heart of a generation that had never seen war but still lived in its echo. When asked why she kept speaking despite her health, she said, "Because people only stop dying when others stop killing. And people only stop killing when they remember what pain feels like." The private battle. But public strength had a private cost. There were nights when pain returned like a ghost, burning, invisible, constant. Her body reminded her that victory never came free. Her husband often found her awake before dawn, staring out the window. When he asked what she was thinking about, she said softly, "About the ones I couldn't save." He would hold her hand brace and whisper, "You saved more than you know." She rarely spoke of fear, but once she confessed in a letter to a friend, "I'm afraid that someday people will think war is glamorous again, that they'll forget what it does to the soul." That was her truest fear. Not death, not memory, but repetition. Recognition. In 1965, on the 20th anniversary of Victory Day, Zinaida Tusnolobova was honored in Moscow's Central Parade. When her name was announced, the crowd of thousands rose to its feet. She rolled forward in her wheelchair, wearing her uniform and medals, her expression calm and proud. Even hardened generals saluted her. Later that day, a journalist asked what that applause meant to her. She smiled faintly. She said quietly, "As a nurse. Just a nurse who didn't stop." And that was the truth of Zinaida Tusnolobova, not a saint, not a symbol, but a woman who learned how to turn pain into light, and in doing so, gave an entire generation the courage to keep living. History rarely remembers healers. It prefers soldiers, commanders, explosions, things that roar. But Zinaida Tusnolobova's story survived not because of noise, but because of how quietly she refused to disappear. By the late 1970s, she was no longer the public symbol that newspapers once celebrated. Her health was failing, her eyesight almost gone. Yet her spirit remained unchanged, a steady flame in a room that had grown dim. Visitors came from every corner of the Soviet Union, students, doctors, foreign journalists. Each of them expected tragedy. Each of them left with hope. The woman who taught the world to heal. In her final interviews, she no longer spoke about the war itself. She spoke about people, about nurses who never came home, about soldiers who learned to laugh again, about the strange beauty of survival. "Pain," she said once, "isn't what breaks you, it's what connects you to others." Those words became her legacy. They were carved on hospital walls, quoted in newspapers, repeated at every medical graduation. For doctors, she was the embodiment of endurance. For women, a reminder that courage had many faces. Not all of them carried rifles. Home and memory. She and her husband Alexei lived quietly in Minsk, in a small apartment filled with plants and the smell of strong tea. He would read aloud from newspapers every morning, describing the world she could no longer see. She listened, smiling, sometimes interrupting. "Tell me about the hospitals. Are they clean? Are the nurses kind?" She cared less about politics, more about people. When her health allowed, she still visited veterans' wards. The nurses there called her Mama Zina. When she entered a room, conversations stopped, eyes filled with tears, and even the dying straightened their posture. One young soldier once told her, "I thought my life was over, but then I met you." She answered softly, "Then promise me it won't be." The light beyond pain. In 1975, she received her final award, the Order of Lenin, for lifelong service to medicine and veterans. During the ceremony, she looked small in her wheelchair, surrounded by generals and ministers. But when she spoke, the hall went silent. "I accept but one who never forgets that every patient has a name." When Alexei died in the late 1970s, she wore black for a month, then returned to work. "I don't have the right to stop," she said. "He carried me through life. Now I must carry others in memory." Neighbours often saw her by the window at dawn, her face turned toward the light. They said it looked as if she were talking to someone unseen. Perhaps she was. Passing the torch. Zinaida Tusnolobova died in 1980, quietly, in her sleep. She was 67. There was no grand funeral. She had asked for none. Only a small gathering of nurses, soldiers, and friends who had once called her sister. They laid her to rest under a birch tree in Minsk, next to a marble plaque that read, "She lived so that others might live." In the decades that followed, her story continued to travel. Hospitals bore her name. Statues appeared in schools, one hand raised in greeting, the other holding a red cross. Every Victory Day, children laid flowers at her grave, white lilies her favourite. Even beyond Russia, her story reached nurses and medics in other countries. In 1985, a group of Vietnamese war nurses translated her letters. In Germany, a young historian who had found her photograph in an archive wrote, "She reminds us that compassion has no side. The light that remains. What endures of Zinaida's life is not the tragedy nor the loss, but the choice she made after. She could have disappeared into bitterness. Instead, she built a bridge between pain and purpose. She once told a young volunteer who asked if she ever felt lonely, "No, every person I helped walks beside me, and every person who helps another carries me with them." That sentence outlived her. It still circulates in nursing schools, on memorial walls, and in the whispered prayers of medics working through long nights. Because Zinaida Tusnolobova never sought immortality, she created continuity. She turned suffering into something usable, something warm, something that still moves through every act of mercy that follows. And so, though her body ended, her light never did. It burns quietly in the hands of those who heal,